Right. So the obvious question, if you're following along the chain of videos, the obvious question is, okay, you have we found so we you now know what kind of where the real harm to the real what's killing what's killing the planet. You now know the sort of the sort of that you sort of know that it makes the death of the death of the planet like or the sort of way in which it's being, you know, what's happening to the planet and what's happening to human beings and everything. We built a picture of it, but the question one would say is, okay, like, who's in charge? Would be the question, right? Like, wait a minute, it means like all this sort of giant entity, like in our country, and there's other things working with it, and who's in charge? And the answer is this. There's an economist who wrote a book that was like a good primer on it called Unholy Alliance, by which he meant the sort of three what do you call them? They're institutional structures that are sort of like making the rules and refereeing and creating the environment to allow for this. Here's where they came from, though. The basic idea, like with that, you don't want to get too like detailed about it because it's just there's one that's really important, and then there's two that are just they're all playing their role, but they set the rules. Okay, if it was at that transnational level, there exist three institutional structures that themselves are, of course, like this is all taking place above governments in some in the sense of what sector it's in. So I mean, it's really above all national economies, but no, there are three institutional structures that are like setting rules. There are rules, and by the way, that's the when it takes a lot of expertise to draft up the kind of trade agreements that allow for this. Let's take what is this unholy alliance that sort of like is the is the what do you say, who's in charge if it's like this of these kind of things, and how can we stop it if it's harming the planet this way? Okay, two of the institutional structures that are like working with this we focusing on this agro sector because it's sort of that's the main thing at attacking the planet and doing all this. It's based here basically. Okay, the two institutional structures that they were part of. Their original mission and sort of mandate was a long ago abandoned. But the point was of this thing, to sort of the World Bank. The point of that, I think it started as the whole idea was that there were societies that were developing. That is, they were completely not industrialized, just agricultural societies, and there would be indeed, I mean, they would want to industrialize, but also they have raw materials that are necessary in the international market, and also there was a concern about there was a concern at some point that these countries would need, and it's rational, would need major loans in order to develop the country. I mean, in other words, like the because of because of whatever because prior to this era, the sort of modern era, right? I mean, there's like the British Empire, like running around what we now call the developing world, like like just slaughtering everyone. So the world picture at a certain point was kind of industrialized countries, and then a set of countries that like had not even yet they weren't up to even an industrial phase. Okay, I mean they had no industry. Okay, so that it was acknowledged that they would need massive loans to develop, and that's one of those good intentions. So that's this World Bank, basically. Then the other one is the International Monetary Fund. Its original mission, we don't make this too complicated. Its original mission was sort of abandoned because it had to do with is stabilizing currencies, and it was sort of not. It was one of the things it was not supposed to do was bail out. It wasn't supposed to. It had a kind of role that was more about keeping currency stable, and then it just devolved into playing a role in this whole thing. But none of their original mission was. There's a World Bank, and then there's an International Monetary Fund. That's and then there's a third one that showed up, and they're sort of in charge. And why they're in charge is this: in the case of places like India, okay, what's going on is this: the World Bank, okay, that gives out these like really big loans to countries like India for development. This goes back a ways. What they started doing is, and certainly they work with economists here, and they do work with Washington in some sense, but they're above it kind of because of the scale of what they're doing by lending amounts of money that large to developing societies for development. What they started doing is putting conditions on the loans. That is, okay, with the development loans for, remember, these are places where there's all the problems that go on in that's what we used to call the third world. Okay, so when they're loaning that much money, they can make conditions. That is, these loans. Well, we only continue to loan you money for development if you meet the following conditions. And around the 1980s, I think when they were preparing for this sort of situation we're in now, they put conditionalities on the loans they were giving countries like India for development. They put conditions that were major structural adjustments to their economy. I mean, there was a structural adjustment period where the kinds of loan conditionalities for development required that they themselves kind of like reorganize their entire economy in the same sense that our economy was reorganized. Structural adjustment was happening all through the 80s, and then now we're in this where this is not the same form of capitalism here than it was at any other time. The same sort of process took place in what we call the developing world, like places like India. Well, India is called a late industrializing country. But, okay, the same structural adjustment, capitalism being reconfigured happened here. It also happened in the developing world. It just happened differently. In the case of the developing world, they put conditions on the loans for development that involve the following. It's a list. Removal of the opening of their markets to foreign penetration by corporations based here and elsewhere, no limits on foreign direct investment. Okay, that's one. Also, the fact that they're agricultural societies, they were sort of mandated again on conditions on which they could be lent in the sums of money they need for development. If you're gonna lend, $20 million, to a society. I mean, you can set conditions. So they were things like this. It'll reorient the economy. You'll be, you are no longer doing an import substitution industrialization. Your markets are no longer closed. You're going to be interacting with the international market. You must grow crops for export. You're exporting to the industrialized world. That's your role. It's often called there's like a way you can draw the picture of how they envisioned it, that these societies where there's like raw materials and also like they're agricultural in nature, that they're just like sort of supplying the industrialized world was the way since like World Bank and IMF, those two institutions saw that's the way to do it. Like, we want you to open the markets up to foreign penetration, and you'll be growing things for export, and that's what you're going to be doing. I mean, those kind of things. Okay. Oh, and of course, and there's no control on capital movements in and out of your country. You're sort of okay. Those kind of things. Okay. So that's how. that's how like our giant agro sector like can just come into India and just operate there. That's different than the way we got with our this giant agribusiness got into Latin America. Slightly different. These were loan conditionalities. Okay, but then what happened is while all this is going on, the individuals involved, the something like our giant agro sector, and who it works with, and these global institutions. I mean, they sat down and were constantly making agreements and arrangements. By the way, when people talk about technocrats, turn that down. Hear the term technocrats. They're the kind of expertise you need to be designing, trade agreements and like how we're going to handle this. That's really you really need to be an expert to do that. Okay, here's the thing. Like they meet in secret because this is what they're doing. They're meeting in secret in like Brussels and Geneva, and they had negotiations for different rounds of this, like but at the different rounds of negotiations about how they're going to do everything at the transnational sector, what structural adjustments have to be made to these other countries that meet the needs of things like our giant agro sector, and then finally it all built up into the formation of the World Trade Organization. Now that's the institutional structure that sort of sets the rules. It's sort of advertised as a organization that deals with disputes, like if transnational capital formations and the leaders in other countries, and if there's a bunch of disputes that need to be sort of arbitrated between, let's say, our giant agro sector is, facing a problem that only is the kind of problem you have when you're operating at that level, you bring it to the World Trade Organization. So what kinds of things do they bring? Here's the thing. The agreements drawn up with the World Trade Organization kind of refereeing, the agreements involve things like breaking through trade barriers, so you can, our agro business can bring a sort of, they arbitrate at the World Trade Organization. There's a problem. We're trying to do all this business in India, but they have environmental regulations that are, we need them removed to do what we want to do. So that's a trade barrier. Like, you can't, but it turns out you can't, dump things into their rivers. Like, this is a barrier to like the way we want to do business. So like, they meet in secret with the World Trade Organization and see if we need to remove all environmental protections in this country because it's hindering the way we want to do business. That kind of thing.